So if you have your Bibles, turn to Revelation 17. I want to talk to you just a little bit about Babylon. And, that was where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken into exile. If you remember, when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. And it was the epitome of godlessness. And if you remember, they were all asked to bow down to an idol. Or bow down to the king. They were asked to pray to no other God than the king. And they all stood up for their faith, and God miraculously saved them through that. And so Babylon came to symbolize the epitome of evil. So in Revelation 17, there is this great prostitute in judgment, and chapter 17, verse 1 and 2. And it says that this great prostitute is with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. So this great prostitute, it's going to tell you that this great prostitute is the city of Rome. And it's going to tell you that in verse 18. The woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Well, at that time it was Rome. But it also says in verse 5 that on the forehead of this great prostitute is the name Babylon. As you read on, you're going to see that this great prostitute is sitting on a beast with 7 heads. And then John's going to give us a key to interpretation and says in verse 9 that these 7 heads are 7 mountains. So what happened is Rome was situated with 7 mountains around it. So the prostitute is the city of Rome, called Babylon, which epitomizes an evil empire, and it's seated on the Roman Empire. And these 7 heads are not only the 7 mountains, but 7 kings. And it goes on to say that the prostitute is drunk with the blood of the saints. Now, I'll tell you all that just to let you know that Babylon carries special significance in the Bible. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, he writes to what he calls exiles. And so he's writing to the Christians who were mainly in the kingdom of Rome, and he says, I'm writing to you because you're exiles. This isn't your country. You're waiting for a heavenly country, one that's still to come. And you're living in symbolic Babylon. In chapter 5, verse 13, he says, greetings from the one who's Babylon. A lot of scholars think that Peter wrote from Rome. And he's saying, I'm writing from the seat, the capital of the evil empire that is persecuting the saints. So I'm writing from Babylon. So when I think about Babylon and the seat of the evil empire, it saddens me to say, but you know that this is true, that our country is becoming more evil all the time. There's no question about it. It's more rampant. It's more difficult to get away from. Sometimes our own government sometimes is caught up, I think, in the schemes of Satan. And so we live today in Babylon. But it's not just any sort of Babylon. It's a digital Babylon in ways that we could have never imagined. Those of us who had rotary phones, those of us who have been on landlines that were parties where you had to take your turn to pick up the phone. That's where my grandmother lived when we went to visit her. I'd pick up the phone. Somebody else was on the phone. I'd have to hang it up. To the idea that now I can take this phone if I wasn't using it for my remote, and I could see where Monica is right now. She's in Phoenix, Arizona, visiting a friend, and I can see exactly what house she's in. It's mind-boggling. And there's some good things that come from phones. I remember when we gave our kids their first phones because we were worried about their security. They were walking home from school. Now, these weren't smartphones back then. These were just phones that could make calls so we could make sure they were okay. One of the nice things about digital technology is that you can listen to sermons online. I have found unbelievable resources on digital media that supports Christian evidences. I know this is going to be a crazy one, but I would dare suspect that there might be somebody in here today that found their mate online. I meet people all the time who met a Christian mate online. They were older maybe, and there was nobody today. And so there's some good things that comes from media. But let's be honest about it. there's a lot more bad than there is good. And it's vying for our hearts. There is a great evil empire that is seeking to destroy our faith, and it's a challenge to keep faith in digital Babylon. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, I felt like I lived in Jerusalem. I went to a Christian school. My teachers were Christian. It seemed like all the stores I went into were Christian. It seemed like the whole United States was Christian. In fact, I thought that the flag was to wrap the Bible in, maybe. And I had a hard time separating the two. But with the ascension of evil in our country is no longer the same. And just to be clear, you know, I wonder sometimes why our country has turned to such evil ways. And I wonder if there's not a clue right here. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 17, it says, "For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled." For some reason, even Rome, persecuting Christians, God allowed it for his purposes. And I've wondered, why is God allowing this? I think sometimes we think, well, we're not going to allow it. Well, you know what? You have your body you can control and your mind, and you can influence others, but you're not in charge. God is. And so there's only so much we can do. Prayer is probably the most powerful thing we can do. Steve reminded us in his class today that when we're surrounded, they're surrounded. That the heavenly armies are still in control, and they're surrounding all this when we feel out of control. But I'll tell you a danger of the United States as God's country problem is we really developed a lot of cultural Christians. It was easy to be a Christian. Anybody could be a Christian. You didn't have to really sacrifice anything. In fact, there was a time in our country that being a Christian helped you get a better job. It probably made you more contacts. I knew people that went to church just so they could sell more people something or another. And so sometimes it takes suffering and persecution to really show who really is a Christian. In Peter chapter 1, if you want to turn there and read this with me, in verse 6 and 7, here's what he says. He says, "In this," he's talking about persecution, by the way, "you rejoice. For though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor to the revelation of Jesus Christ." I hate hearing this. But what he's telling you is sometimes persecution proves your faith. Is it truly faith if you never have to sacrifice anything or give anything up? And I have to remind myself that God's plan to save the world isn't the United States of America, it's the church of Christ. It's the church that Jesus died for. God's plan to save your children isn't the United States of America. They're going to Pied Piper them away into hell. His plan to save your children is the church. And so we need to be serious about keeping our faith in digital Babylon, and we have some significant challenges. And one of the challenges is that digital, which Satan uses as something that we can worship and pour our lives into, dominates us. We worship at the feet of digital gods. And I'm preaching to myself here. Did you know that research says that most people tap or swipe their phones 2,617 times a day? Dick was saying that he thought he had done about 2,400 Lord's Suppers in this church building. Well, I pulled out my phone. I thought, man, I hope people don't think I'm looking at my phone because I'm about to preach about this. And I got my calculator out, divided that up, and it was about 46 years if he didn't miss a Sunday. But we do 2,617 times a day. We unlock our phones 80 times a day. The average person spends 3 hours a day on their phone. I think I'm at least average or better. And I don't know how good that is. And did you know that if you started on your phone at age 12 and went to age 80, that you would spend 10 years on your phone? And there's a lot more bad on our phone than there is good. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says this, beginning in verse 15. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Be careful how you walk, how you spend your time, what you're looking at, what you're doing, because the days are evil. Don't be foolish, it goes on to say, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So we have a tremendous challenge with this great digital distraction and the evil that can come through it to keep our focus on the Lord. It's a challenge before us. And I want to share with you some of the consequences that we've already experienced because we haven't faced the challenge really well. And the first one is just that relationships have been repressed. Jesus says this, a new command I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you also, you are to love one another. And then he goes on to say, by this, that you love one another, all people will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Well, I dare say that this, over here on my left, gets in the way. You know, you shouldn't have your kids asking you to get off your phone so you can spend time with them. You shouldn't have your mate asking you to get off the phone because they want to talk to you. You shouldn't have your phone distracting you during church. And I've been guilty of all these, so I'm preaching to me as well. The phone has become almost our God, and it's separating us from each other. It's stealing more than it's giving. You know, I hope your breakfast doesn't look like this. Cuss and Griffiths did a study in 2017, and they concluded that people actually have less skill and ability to relate to each other face to face because of the screen. A lot of people just do church online. I don't know how you can love one another the way Jesus commanded when you're doing church online. We have sort of cocooned ourselves. We've sort of dived deeply into a digital world where we don't need anything. I can order my groceries from my phone. I can order movies from my phone. I can order, I don't even have to see people. When I go to the gas station now, I have an app and it connects with the fuel station. I can do everything with my phone. And I think that people are attending church less because of the digital world. I think we're less hospitable. If you think about it, the 10 years we spend on our phone, or the 5 years, or the 6 years, how much more time could have we spent with each other? How many strangers could have we invited into our house? How many of the lost could have we shared Jesus with? I think there's less love because of the digital world, and Satan's using it to repress relationships. Second thing is he's muddling our morality. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14 through 16, Peter says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it's written, you shall be holy, for I'm holy. God made us. Your life isn't an accident. But he made us in his image, and because he's holy, we're meant to be holy. But we live in a culture that somehow says that morality is your personal truth. That what's right for you, nobody can challenge. And what they're doing is they're rejecting God. They're rejecting an objective means of morality. And they're doing what Romans 1 says. They're rejecting God, and they're making the center of knowledge creation itself, the creature. When you do that, you make yourself God. You decide what's right for you. You decide what's wrong for you. It doesn't matter what the Word of God says. And this has led people to reject the idea of creation, reject the idea of God having a purpose for your life. It's led people to reject their own bodies. And I'm going to talk some more about this next week, but some people are mutilating their bodies because it doesn't fit with their personal truth. The bodies that God gave them. It makes no sense. And the world is pushing this message on us in a more persistent and pervasive way than I've ever seen before. Monica and I found this series that we loved a while back on Netflix called New Amsterdam. And it was about this hospital. And there was at least one person living a lifestyle that I didn't agree with. But, that's out there in the world. So it didn't bother me too much. And we watched several seasons of it. And then all of a sudden we started on the last season. And all of a sudden, every single show was pushing some sort of sexual agenda on us. I'm like, what the heck just happened? Excuse me, but that's about the right word for what I saw. And in one of the shows, there were 5 couples. None of them were married. One was heterosexual. The others were everything but, including one group that 3 or 4 of them were living together. And I'm like, what on earth is going on? And I decided I can't watch this anymore. I turned it off. I got suspicious, and so I started looking. And a liberal author said, New Amsterdam was really a great show, and it was real subtly pushing a little bit of a progressive agenda, but then they got too in everybody's face, and they started pushing it real hard, and the viewers dropped by 2/3, and they had to cancel it. I thought, well, thank God the viewership dropped. I think that there's still a lot of people out there, I think, that have some sensibilities and some moral sensibilities that come from God. But then I got to thinking, it said before they got aggressive, they were already pushing it. I was already watching them push it a little bit, and it didn't reach my level of discomfort, and they were already pushing it, and then it went over my level of discomfort, and I got rid of it. But everywhere you look, the world is pushing this agenda, and it's really taken hold with the young people. Because they get exposed and deluded and persuaded by this before you ever have a chance to deal with them. It's a very serious problem. And not only will the digital muddle your morality, it will tempt you to be immoral, or it will make you angry. It will tempt you. The access to porn is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The amount of addiction to porn is unbelievable in our society. I read somewhere that 50% of pastors struggle with it, and I'm like, are you serious? And it's because it just takes a little tap and you're there, and it sucks you in and steals your soul. And I can't tell you how many of you have told me, well, I can't even watch politics anymore. It makes me too angry. Well, good job. Stop. I mean, it's just stirring us up and making us angry and tempting us to be immoral. We're in the middle of a battle. And the digital methodology is one of the main ways Satan is going after us. And not only that, persecution is pervasive. In John 15:18-19, Jesus says this: if the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world, well, the world would love you because the world loves its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So Jesus says, don't be surprised there's a battle. Don't be surprised if people in the world hate your exclusive Christianity, hate your morality, hate what they would call your self-righteousness. There's a battle going on. And we need to be open-eyed about it. Kinnaman, who wrote the book You Lost Me, and it's a book about how we've lost the younger generation, wrote a new book called Faith in Exiles. And in this book, in Faith in Exiles, he does research and talks about how we keep our faith. And the first one was why they lost it. Now, how we help our young people keep it. And he says that 61% of Christians report that they're uncomfortable sharing their faith. They're afraid they're going to offend somebody. Well, Satan has us right where he wants us. We're embarrassed to tell people we're Christians half the time. I know that my wife is a teacher, and she feels compelled at school to be careful about what she says. Adam Zabo has shared some of his own kind of struggles with that with us. And he likes to put up a proverb and not tell them where it's from. That's one of his ways of trying to get the word out there. And I have a friend that I saw just recently, and he has to put on his email header, at the bottom rather, in the footer, he has to put his pronouns. He's required to do it. That's crazy. And so there is a form of persecution going on. We don't live in Jerusalem anymore. I don't know if we ever did, but we definitely live in Babylon more than we ever have before. And how are we going to respond to maintain faith? How are we going to respond to save our children? And one of the worst things about this is that it just suppresses us spiritually. It's a spiritual suppression that's going on. Kinnaman says in his research that 64% of the people admit that because of digital, they don't spend time praying like they should. They don't spend time reading the Bible like they should. They don't spend time going in person to church services like they should. They don't spend time developing spiritual relationships. And they say it's directly connected to how much they're on digital. I found myself, by the way, on the way here today, this morning early, every time I hit a stop sign or a stoplight, I found my hand heading to my phone. But because I was preaching the sermon, I pulled it back with my left hand. I chastised it and I prayed instead. And I prayed all the way here this morning. But it took me a while to get my right hand to quit going over to the phone. And we wonder why we're more disconnected than we've ever been as a society from our soul and from our spirit. We wonder why there's so much depression in our country, why there's such a lack of peace and so much anxiety, and why there's so much suicide. And part of it is because our spiritual longings that God gave us to reach out to Him, to know Him, to become more like Him, those are being choked off by binge TV watching, gaming, texting, phone surfing, social media. It's choking off our spiritual longings. And God calls us to so much more. And so this series over the next 5 weeks after today is going to be about what can we do to combat this? How do we maintain our faith? How do we make sure that we are the ones that disciple our kids and not the digital Babylon world? How do we make sure that we stay firm in the Lord and we don't get sucked into this digital vortex that pulls us away from God? That's what we're going to be talking about over the next 5 weeks. Kinnaman says that 10% of 18 to 20-year-olds still have what he considers a strong faith. Now, if I remember right, he says that's about 4 million 18 to 20-year-olds. So one of the things he does is he studies them to find out what made their faith stronger. And so we're going to insert some of that research through this series that he came up with. These are 5 practices that help us strengthen our faith in the onslaught of evil that comes because we live in digital Babylon. And these 5 practices are important for us to be engaged in. If you aren't engaged in these practices, you will personally be vulnerable to the digital virus of Babylon. There is a virus out there, and it's an evil one, and there's a vaccination that actually really works. But you have to partake of it, and we're going to talk about how we can partake of that. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, he says this, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So preparing your minds for action, being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's what we want to do the next 5 weeks, is to fully set our minds on Jesus and to prepare ourselves for the type of action it takes to fight evil in our lives, in the lives of our kids, and to win others to Christ. We have these core values up here on my left on that wall. And in the book, it goes in this order: pursue God passionately, grow each and every day in the Spirit, unite as family in Christ, and love and serve others. And those are 5 things that we want to be about. Those are our 5 practices, and the practices I'm going to be teaching about will be slightly different but connected. If you don't pour yourself into a core value, you will kneel at the God of digital, and it will give you your values, but they won't draw you any closer to God. And so we're here today to remind all of us that we only kneel to Jesus Christ. He's the only foundation for faith and our only hope in this fallen world. If we can encourage you in any way, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.